We're here. We're live. It's happening.
We are live. Hold on, I need to.
Welcome to the Chaotic Bisexual Text Study. I'm Pastor Matthew. I use pronouns like he and they.
And I'm Pastor Abel Arroyo, and I use pronouns like they and he. Welcome and thank you for being with us in this exhausting week of churchwide assembly. For those of you who are part of the ELCA, there's a lot going on. There's a lot to talk about, um, and we will eventually. But Jesus first.
Jesus first, because we got people that's got to preach on Sunday.
Yeah.
So we're gonna cut to the chase, everyone, and we're gonna read the Bible. And before we read the Bible, we're gonna pray from our hearts because that's where we are today.
That's the kind of way we chaotic, bisexual, chaotic
I
today.
mean, it's on the brand because it's chaotic. See,
Yeah.
anyway, let's pray. Dear God, thank you for today and for making us in your image and giving us the breath of life and another opportunity to wake up and love you and see you and discern how you're moving in this world. Help us to bravely proclaim the truth for the sake of the world, even if that means having difficult conversations and, dare I mean, conflict. Help us see fire as both destruction and purifying renewal. Bless us as we read this text, and may your good news emerge for us in this time and this place. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. And the reading for today comes from Luke chapter 12, 49 to 56. I came to bring fire to the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. I have a baptism with which to be baptized, and what stress I am under until it is completed. Same. Do you think that I have come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, five in one household will be divided, three against two, and two against three. They will be divided, father against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother in law against her daughter in law, etc., etc. Um, he also said to the crowd, "When you see a cloud rising in the west, you immediately say it is going to rain, and so it happens. And when you see the south wind blowing, you say there will be scorching heat, and it happens. You hypocrites! You know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time? All right then."
Happy rap.
Happy Rad Month, everyone.
Well,
So I think the second part of this pericope, I think is fascinating because we are in this weird monsoon season here in Arizona that has been extra stormy. And a couple of weeks ago, I was having a conversation with my husband Jeffrey, and he was looking at his phone. And he was like, "Oh, there's a storm, but that's not gonna hit us." And I just look at the sky and look at the clouds, and I was like, "No, the storm is right here." And he was like, "No, but the map says," and he shows me his phone, and I'm like, "I know what the phone says, but the cloud said otherwise." And we ended up getting rained on, and that's part of. I lived in Costa Rica, and in Costa Rica, after March, you get rain every day, usually about the same time. You get your first rain. So you learn living in that environment, like you learn to look at the sky and be like, oh yeah, it's gonna rain, or like, oh yeah, I have maybe another hour before it rains, like hard enough that I can't go anywhere type stuff. So that was one of the Bible references. I just loved it because I was like, oh yeah, I can. That's a skill I picked up. I can look at the sky and be like, yeah, it's gonna rain, and I have this much time before I have to find shelter.
I love, you know how I like looking at the sky.
Yeah.
I like a good no phone store. I'm thinking about this text and how I'm a conflict averse person, and we talked a lot about conflict aversion and how it's necessary in this. Like Jesus is saying conflict is necessary and it's a part of like his journey to Jerusalem. Um, and the tension between like conflict that can be constructive and sacred and holy, and conflict that is destructive, and how destruction's sometimes good, and also like evil and violence.
Right. I grew up in a part of the world, like in Peru, where like forest fires are not a thing.
Hmm.
So when I moved to California, when my family immigrated to the United States and we moved to California, like for me it was the weirdest thing to see like forest fires and like like you get those like little like things that is like not very likely. Oh, it's fire
Like over
season, like
there.
the little thing. And I was like, this is stupid. Like, why? And like, it took me a while for me to understand that forest fires were part of the natural cycle of the biome. And then we have like the forest fires that are just like destructions because of like neglect from like our end, and that's a completely different thing, right? So like I for me that's a good illustration of like when we talk about fire, like it's easy to go to like this is very destructive thing, it has no place if you want to live and thrive, and but like then naturally occurring fires are necessary for the ecosystem to thrive. And I think it's the same way with conflict. Like there is conflict that is natural, that is even healthy, and then there's conflict that is just destructive and has no benefit to it.
Mm. How do you how do you discern between the two?
I mean, sometimes you just have to wait until the very end and see the outcome.
Uh,
I know, like it's not an easy thing, but like
that's an honest answer.
sometimes you just have to be like, okay, let's see how that turns out. And like if it turns out that this is like a life-giving thing, then that's gonna be the outcome, right? But like on the same note, I I don't want to say I love it, but like a little bit I love when people are like, no, this is good conflict. Like we need to come together and struggle. And like I'm not here to struggle for free. Like I like sometimes it's not like pick your struggle, but like it's more about knowing that not everything, every conversation and every interaction has to be a struggle. Not every interaction has to be a challenge. Not every interaction has to be like conflict, but like sometimes people guarantee that this conflict is going to be good and then the outcome is trash. And you're like, well, that wasn't life-giving conflict in the end.
Hmm.
And conflict doesn't necessarily mean a green light for like traumatizing everyone, which I think it's often conflated with as well.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like the results, and I also think about back to forest fires, and like in theory, like humans and the forest co-evolve together with fire, because like the forests need managed fires in the west, which were intentionally managed by like the first people there. So like they like would produce, like it was this whole horticultural system. And horticulture is just like using nature for gardening. It's like foraging, but like on superpowers, because you listen to the plants in the community. Um, and like fire is like one of the four elements in a lot of like classic Western thought. But like even if it's a destructive fire, even if it's a fire that leaves everything completely like annihilated, like their life will eventually come back and those components that were burned are transformed into something else. Whether it's our life or not, like or for our own benefit in this generation or not, like that's not really salient because the fire will it's just a part of creation and destruction. But like there is destruction, which I was
Okay,
uncomfortable with.
Full Metal Alchemist. No, but like I think it's important to say that fire is not everything, right? Just like conflict is not everything. Like conflict exists in relationship with like this network of interactions.
Mhm,
And I think that when we want to look at conflict as an absolute,
mhm.
not interacting with anything else, not existing in a context, then we have the risk of looking at conflict and being like, oh, this is an absolute like negative thing, which is something that happens, in the West, like conflict resolution in the West, like culturally hinges on that aversion to conflict.
Hmm.
Because like if we cannot push back against conflict, then we're just subservient and we just let it happen. Because like, for the sake of peace, we don't do A, B, or C, and then we just let abuse happen.
Yeah, because and like it's not really peace because peace doesn't mean absence of conflict. Peace like is constructive and developing. And I think Jesus is trying to say, like in this text, that like conflict will exist in our journey together. And like he doesn't say anything new about family. It's like daughter-in-law will be divided against mother-in-law, and water is wet. And like if the wind blows in the south, it's gonna be hot. So like know where you are. And I think I mean, we talked a lot about my own conflict aversion and like but like even for the scale of like white people, I don't know how else to say. Like I think about my own family and like growing up, my mom was working like 60 hours a week. My dad was in jail, my sister and me, and we'd all share the chores. And like if you and my sister and me were like our burnt out, gifted and talented kids TM, and it's just like there's a lot going on all at once. Hormones
Yeah.
everywhere. And like we would just reach a point where everyone would scream at each other. There would just be like yelling. And then, is this normal? Why are like we need help? But then later in therapy, I would talk about it. And like it's sort of like, well, afterwards, like it was all resolved. Everyone got their feelings out. Like most of the time, 99% of the time, no one said anything that like permanently hurt somebody else. And like we worked through it and we're better for it. But it was like almost the shame of like having a conflict that was holding us back rather than just like taking it and learning from it and learning how to like figure out our emotions before they get explosive.
Right.
Because no amount of
Listen.
what
Yes. No. Finish, please.
I was like, no amount of positive thinking is gonna like stop conflict from happening, and no amount of avoiding something is gonna stop it from happening. It's a natural part of life.
And conflict is not the same thing as abuse at all. Like, I wasn't going to talk about this, but like, I'm deciding right now that I will. Like, my mom was in a marriage for 4 years, and I got to witness most of those 4 years. And that idea of like, oh, we can't say this, or we can't do this, or we can show this, or we can't react to this, for the sake of peace, um, only embolden her aggressor. and he kept pushing and pushing and pushing until it became so overbearing and so abusive and so violent that there was nothing that could be done for the sake of peace other than self-harm, just allowing harm to happen to ourselves. And not even then we got peace as a family.
Mm.
So like this idea of like discernment in the second half of the text, I really appreciate, because one thing is conflict, like we've said, and conflict has like a number of facets, but like it can be differentiated from straight up abuse and manipulation, and like I think it's important to recognize that those are different things. I mean, am I speaking from my trauma? Probably. But like I think it speaks to a larger reality as well.
Well, and there's like conflict, and then there's manipulation, there's abuse, and there's violence. And I think we have a lot of divergence too around violence. And I think it's more, you said something that, like, in my case, like the discomfort and the avoidance of violence is a privilege in some way, in many ways, because like, but like that's what the United States is built off of in the same way is the offshoring of violence onto other areas for our own benefit. And
Hmm.
so um we have this aversion to violence, and like that's also a part of my own upbringing. A unique part of my own upbringing is like this thread of being a descendant of people from peace churches who like also knew violence and chose not to retaliate, but that's not the reality I found myself in, and nor is it within 2 or 3 generations of me. And I've always found it sympathetic because nonviolence is what's lifted up in our school system as like the end all be all of conflict resolution. And I just remember your pushback, but I remember you saying something to me a few weeks ago. And when I was packing up my stuff, I was going through my paper for one of Vitor Westell's classes. And it was my confessions class. No, it wasn't confessions. It was it was called Jesus, the Kingdom, and the Church because they redid the curriculum.
Hmm.
And it was ecclesiology. So ecclesiology is a fancy word for like the study of what is church. And it was about the Baltimore uprisings in 2015 when the police killed Freddie Gray, and the subsequent most people in the community called it an uprising, whereas like white supremacy called it a riot. Um, and there's a Lutheran church also that was a sanctuary, Amazing Grace Lutheran Church in East Baltimore. Shout out. Um, but I remember the end of it. He wrote, like, I got an A-. He wrote, "Why were you so insistent on trying to defend the protests or demonstrations as nonviolent?" Question mark. And then I remember taking a class. It was a secular class on religion at my undergrad called "Peace and Violence in the Abrahamic Faiths," taught by a like rabbi and like Abrahamic scholar. And that was the other thing. He's like, "No, you can't say Jesus was nonviolent." He's like, "In the source material, it says this." So, like, from
Hmm.
that source perspective, Jesus is not inherently nonviolent. I would say Jesus strives for peace, and Jesus strives. And how is Jesus getting people up to this point? By saying we have to expect division and conflict, and how because there's already a community there, and he's trying to build this movement beyond his death and resurrection. And he's like, we have to take a stand at some point as we're building tension that's going to call for my life. And that's not how Jesus led off. He wasn't saying, everyone go home, and if they're not with me right now, fuck them.
Right. This reminds me of this conversation I had in seminary with a friend. We were looking at this picture of, I think it was a sculpture of Jesus in pain during the crucifixion. And he kept calling it beautiful. And we had this really like heart to heart conversation about why does something have to be beautiful to have value? You know, like that piece could be a number of things, but in his mind it had to be labeled as beautiful in order to be like appropriate iconography.
Hmm. Hmm.
I don't even know if appropriate is like the right word, but like that's where I am right now. And I'm just like like in my mind, like it really comes down to like what's acceptable, right? In our culture, and like suffering and ugliness and pain like is not something acceptable to talk about. So we will just rather label it, this beautiful process of reinventing yourself. And like, we use euphemisms to cover the fact that um there's pain and there's violence and there is like conflict behind things, but god forbid we name it for what it is, right? Because it's not acceptable to say like, oh yeah, conflict is necessary and it's a part of life.
Hmm. Hmm. Oof.
Which, like, full disclosure, I am not a pacifist, and that was one of my big arguments against being a pacifist. Um, for me, like, and maybe I'm just not woken up or whatever, but it's really hard to be a pacifist and non-violent with a boot on your neck. Like I think it can be very privileged to preach about nonviolence to a community that is fighting for liberation. Like, yes, I will be violent against a structure that is trying to kill me, and that's fine. I will dismantle it. But is that violence? Yes, it is. And it's okay. And is that conflict? Yes, it is. And it's okay. Like, and I guess this is part of like my, coming from a literal colony of Spain, of the Kingdom of Spain. Like, we had to fight and war and dismantle uh, colonial supremacy, like colonial institutions that said that um, we were not people at first, and then like we could maybe be people if we were mixed with Europeans, and like it gets like really crappy very quickly. Um, and to say that the only like it's inappropriate to fight this and to engage in conflict against an institution that tells me that I'm not human, like to me that kind of like mentality, that kind of pacifism, and that kind of nonviolence is absurd.
Hmm. Yeah. I had a friend who worked for a long time in like higher ed admin at a Mennonite college, talking about the teaching that like the teaching around self-defensive violence in their culture wasn't that it's necessarily banned, but rather that we lament for it because self-defensive like violence hurts both people no matter what, because committing violence hurts ourselves. And I think that there's that important thing of I kind of came to the like how I personally feel about how I'm gonna like interact with like others, like I guess our tactics, right? I think it's a conversation about tactics in this movement for liberation, like which is inherently like that Jesus is calling us to be a part of movements of liberation because our God is a breaker of chains and like breaker of prison cells. And I think when we talk about tactics, though, I think me as somebody who like has an experience having a literal boot to my neck, right? I'm never going to say like I'm never going to sit from my position of power and privilege and say like I'm going to reject this as a holistic. I'm going to restrict violence as a holistic strategy because I've never been there. Just like I don't have a uterus, and I'm like not gonna like know what somebody else is gonna do with their own bodily autonomy and like
Mm-hmm.
our bodily autonomy and our communal autonomy. And at the same time, if I'm invited into a community and that community has said like we need to engage in self-defensive violence, and I ask myself where is my role and how can I best serve this with my gifts and my own not everyone has to take like an active role, and it's not always like all violence, but like this insistence that we be docile, but at the same time, there's no question of the hostility of the powers and principalities of this world.
I mean, the amount of times that you have been a white shield to people of color who work with you,
Oh yeah,
or just friends. Because like you, at least in our relationship, you played that role quite a few times, and I'm very, very thankful because like you gave me by you doing that, you gave me respite to like collect myself and be ready to react. But sometimes, like without that buffer, you just kind of like take it as it comes, like so. There is something to be said about like that kind of posture from the people who can do it, who have the to like use your privilege in a way that is positive. Like just how we talk about like conflict, having a good side and not good and bad, but like conflict being acceptable or not acceptable. Like there are ways to use your privilege that can be life giving.
yeah, and I think it's about being a like it's that community. I think we even had the conversation about like was I a part of like our is what like is white suburbia is like our white ex-urban communities are like majority like 98 95% these communities that are like 90 to 100% 99% white, are they actually communities? Are these just individuals living a lie and like committing constant violence on themselves or others by refusing to like even engage in or build community?
Hmm.
um and it's like what is our role in all of this? And I think it's hard. I mean, I'm staying with long, but like I've been talking with my mom more about this text too, and she actually liked it, um, which is surprising because she's pretty conflict averse. But it was about like, yeah, you have to have conflict, and sometimes it's uncomfortable, but that's part of it. And I think she talked about like, protecting us when my father was in active addiction, and she didn't feel it was safe. And she even talked about feeling a sign of the times and asking for a sign. And I think there's power in like listening to what God like prayer is listening, and sometimes you don't even need to like prayer is sometimes walking in silence and listening and discerning. And I think that's the point too, because that's like how are we going engaging in holy conflict, and whereas where when are we having a tantrum making this about ourselves and this reactionary thing that sometimes is sort of dysregulation and other times or or is about us, whether we're conscious or unconscious of it, right? And I think of how in times of great stress that happens, and how churches, from at every level of our expressions, become theaters for people's conflicts and issues because of this estrangement from community and because of white supremacy culture that is conflict averse.
Hmm.
And I think we talked about like, going into a parish and being like, no one wants me because I'm going in and saying you're all racist all the time. Like and that's not how you enter into a parish. And I'm speaking from experience, having been invited to be present for a Black Lives Matter march in the community I was serving. Um, by youth leaders in a community that was once a sundown town. And like the
Mhm.
fact that one of the organizers had his brakes cut. And how can I tell him that he's not to be violent?
Right. I think it's I remember this experience from internship where there was like at that point I was more than halfway through, so that means I had been there for about 6 months plus, and I remember one of my supervisors, asking me like why I was so adamant about talking about justice to a specific situation that was happening in our community.
Mm.
And like her big thing was, well, you can't be prophetic if you're not part of the community. And one, that was super unhelpful because at that point I was a part of the community. I had been there for 6 months as part of the immersion. And two, like if we look at, like, you need to have, like, I don't know how you can say this, like you can't be prophetic. You can't be inflammatory. You can't speak to evil. You can't speak to a situation that clearly needs gospel, Christ in it. Um, so I was completely in disagreement with that, right? And but that came back, and I had to pay the consequence of going against my supervisor because she was like, "No, you can't be prophetic about this. That's not your role." And that's why I always suspect when people are like, "No, we don't," like when white people don't know how to deal with conflict, I become a little suspect because to me that has been an indication of people not wanting to deal with their own stuff and
Mhm.
then projecting that into like the community.
Okay, that's the show. That's it.
That's it.
That's a word and a half.
Well, amen then. What's the gospel for you?
Oh God, well, I had a statement. Hold on. It's hmm, kind of like
For
it's sort of.
me,
I think it. Sorry, go
look,
ahead.
so you have a little more time to think about it. Like for me, 56, that is my evangelical there, but for me 56, it's a gospel statement on its own. I love that, even though there's a strong criticism here, right? Like because it starts, "You hypocrites." There's that affirmation of like, what's right. Just why don't you do it?
Oh,
And for me, that is good news because like that means Jesus is saying like, what's right. Just get to
do
it.
do the right thing. That's the
Exactly. Like how is that not gospel?
do the right.
Is it inflammatory? Yes. Is it confrontational? Yes, but it's still gospel.
And to all the white people that live in Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights, if you haven't seen Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, in fact, everyone, if you're not doing anything tonight, that's what you're doing. Do the right thing. Unless you know what it's about and you want to avoid that because it has to deal with police violence. That's the content note.
Ugh.
But it's Spike Lee. It's it's a whole thing. So I think that, but the really I think I was gonna pick that one too. Maybe it's a cop out. Maybe it's I'm just an agreeable person. I'm a Libra. Who knows? But I think it's the trust your gut. Like every time where and sometimes my gut like creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, but like lately when I've been like, oh, this is what my gut is saying, this is what my body and experience are saying. I've done the work with my own trauma to know like what how to parse that out and say, I'm going to trust the situation and I'm going to engage it with wisdom and a grounding in who's and who I am and what is right. And what's that famous hymn written by that guy from backwater Germany? A mighty fortress is our God. And one little word subdues him being the evil one. Also him pejorative.
Oh my god.
Also not him from Powerpuff Girls.
No.
Anyway, it's been 35 minutes and we were planning on doing 2020 on CWA updates. That's church-wide assembly updates.
Assembly.
But
So why don't we take a break so that people can be like, this is the end of the Bible portion.
yeah, there's a song by Dashboard Confession.
Is it Earth is Ghetto? No.
No. Oh no, wait. Ah. That was under 10 seconds.
Oh my god. Copyright violations, everyone. No.
We ban it. I don't know what that's. Anyway, we're taking a deep breath. Hello, welcome to the church-wide assembly 20.
Okay, no, I actually need to take a break though. So let's.
I need to. Oh wait. Goodbye, everyone. We'll be back soon.